The fastest way to lose a marriage is to let someone else sit in the place that belongs to your spouse. When I married Michael Carter 16 years ago, I thought I was building a life with a kind, dependable man who wanted the same things I did. We dreamed about a comfortable home, family vacations, quiet evenings together, and growing older side by side. Looking back now, I realized there was always someone else standing between us, even when I refused to see it. My name is Emily Carter, and for years I convinced myself that the small problems in our marriage were temporary. I believed patience would solve them. I believed love would solve them. Most of all, I believed Michael would eventually understand what was happening. In the beginning, his mother Patricia seemed welcoming enough. She called often, offered advice, and wanted to stay involved in our lives. At first, I thought it was sweet. She helped us choose furniture for our first house. She shared recipes. She asked about our plans. Nothing felt unusual. But slowly, her opinions stopped sounding like suggestions and started sounding like decisions. If Michael and I talked about taking a vacation, Patricia already had thoughts about where we should go. If we discussed moving to a different neighborhood, Patricia had reasons why we should stay exactly where we were. If we considered a major purchase, somehow her approval became part of the conversation before a final choice was made. I noticed it long before Michael did. Or maybe he noticed it and simply did not want to address it. Whenever I brought up my concerns, he smiled and told me I was worrying too much. "She is only trying to help," he would say. I heard that sentence so often it became part of the background noise of my life. One Saturday afternoon, about 5 years into our marriage, we sat together on the back patio discussing renovations we wanted to make to the kitchen. It was supposed to be a conversation between husband and wife. We talked about colors, cabinets, and a larger island for family gatherings. By evening, Patricia had somehow joined the discussion over the phone. Within 30 minutes, the project no longer reflected what Michael and I wanted. It reflected what Patricia thought was best. I remember sitting quietly at the table after the call ended. Michael seemed excited. I felt invisible. That moment should have been a warning. Instead, I made excuses. I told myself it was only a kitchen. Then it became holiday plans. Then financial decisions. Then future goals. Little by little, important parts of our marriage passed through Patricia before they reached a final decision. The strange part was that Michael never appeared malicious. He genuinely loved his mother. He respected her opinion. He wanted everyone to get along. What he failed to understand was that every time he placed her voice beside mine, our marriage became less about us and more about managing someone else's influence. At the time, I still believed things would change. I still believed that one day Michael would recognize the difference between honoring his mother and allowing her to control parts of our life together. What I did not know was that the cost of waiting for that realization would become far greater than either of us imagined. As the years passed, Patricia's influence became so woven into our daily life that many people probably would not have noticed it. The changes happened slowly. There was never a single dramatic moment that made me think our marriage was in danger. Instead, there were hundreds of smaller moments that accumulated over time. One year, Michael and I planned a weekend getaway for our anniversary. We had not taken a trip alone in nearly 18 months, and I was excited to spend uninterrupted time together. 2 days before we were scheduled to leave, Patricia called and mentioned that she needed help organizing several things around her house. By the end of that conversation, Michael was suggesting that we postpone our trip. He insisted it was only for a few weeks. Those few weeks became several months, and eventually the trip never happened. Another time, we discussed converting one of our spare rooms into a home office for me. I worked remotely several days each week and needed a dedicated space. Michael initially agreed. We measured the room and even looked at furniture options online. Then Patricia visited one weekend and suggested the room should remain available for family members who might need a place to stay. Within days, the office plans disappeared. Situations like that became increasingly common. Every major decision seemed to pass through an invisible filter. If Patricia approved, the idea moved forward. If she did not, somehow the conversation changed direction until her preference became the final outcome. What frustrated me most was not Patricia's behavior. It was Michael's inability to recognize what was happening. Whenever I tried to explain how I felt, he looked genuinely confused. He viewed every issue separately. I was seeing the pattern. One evening after dinner, I finally attempted a more direct conversation. We sat together in the living room while rain tapped softly against the windows. I told him I felt like our marriage no longer belonged to the two of us. I explained that every important decision seemed to involve his mother's approval. Michael listened quietly before responding with the same argument I had heard for years. He said Patricia only wanted what was best for us. He said family should support one another. He said I was interpreting ordinary situations too negatively. As he spoke, I realized something painful. We were no longer discussing individual events. We were living in two completely different versions of reality. In his version, everyone was helping. In mine, our marriage was slowly losing its independence. After that conversation, I stopped bringing up specific examples as often. Not because the problems disappeared, because repeating myself felt exhausting. Each time I raised a concern, the outcome remained the same. Michael defended his mother. Patricia remained involved. Nothing changed. Yet despite my growing frustration, I continued believing things would improve. I loved my husband. I remembered the man I married and the future we once imagined together. I kept hoping he would eventually see what I saw. What I did not understand at the time was that every year spent waiting for that realization was quietly creating a distance between us that would become increasingly difficult to close. The distance between Michael and me did not appear overnight. It grew quietly through moments that seemed insignificant when viewed separately. A canceled plan here, a dismissed concern there, a decision postponed because someone else's opinion carried more weight than mine. By the time I fully understood what was happening, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. One Thanksgiving stands out more clearly than any other. We had volunteered to host dinner at our house. For weeks, I planned the menu, prepared the guest list, and organized every detail. I wanted the day to feel warm and welcoming. The morning of the gathering, Patricia arrived early. Within an hour, she began rearranging decorations, changing serving dishes, and offering instructions about how everything should be done. I tried to remain polite. It was a holiday, and I did not want unnecessary tension. But as the day progressed, I noticed something familiar. Every suggestion Patricia made quickly became the new plan. Every opinion she offered carried authority. Whenever I looked toward Michael for support, he simply smiled and encouraged everyone to relax. Later that evening, after the guests left, I finally told him how frustrated I felt. I explained that I no longer felt like a partner in my own home when his mother was involved. Instead of listening, Michael immediately defended her. He said she was only trying to help. He said I should appreciate her experience. He said I was focusing on the wrong things. As I listened, I realized the conversation was not really about Thanksgiving. It was about every similar moment that had come before it. What hurt most was not Patricia's behavior. It was knowing that whenever conflict appeared between my feelings and his mother's preferences, I could already predict which side Michael would choose. Over time, that certainty became deeply discouraging. I stopped expecting support. I stopped expecting him to notice when boundaries were crossed. There were moments when I needed him most. When work became stressful. When family problems arose. When important decisions had to be made. Again and again, I found myself competing with a voice that always seemed to carry more influence than my own. The strange thing was that Michael genuinely believed he was keeping peace. In his mind, avoiding conflict was an act of kindness. What he never understood was that every avoided conflict came at a cost. The cost was trust. The cost was connection. The cost was the feeling that husband and wife were supposed to be building a life together. One evening, several months after Thanksgiving, I sat alone on our back porch watching the sunset fade behind the trees. Michael was inside speaking with Patricia on the phone. The conversation had already lasted nearly an hour. As I listened to his voice through the screen door, I felt an unexpected realization settle over me. I was no longer waiting for a specific problem to be solved. I was waiting for Michael to choose our marriage as his first priority. And for the first time, I began wondering whether that moment would ever come. It was not anger that filled me as I sat there. It was sadness. Deep, quiet sadness. Because somewhere along the way, the future I thought we were building together had become crowded with someone else's influence, and the man I loved seemed unable to see how much damage that influence was causing. For a long time, I became an expert at explaining away things that should have concerned me. Every time Patricia inserted herself into a decision, I found a reason to minimize it. Every time Michael chose the easier path instead of addressing a problem, I convinced myself he was under pressure. Looking back, I can see how desperately I wanted our marriage to succeed. The truth was uncomfortable, so I kept rewriting it into something easier to accept. One spring, an opportunity came up that should have been exciting for both of us. My company offered me a promotion that included greater responsibility and a significant increase in salary. It was the kind of opportunity one had worked toward for years. The position would require occasional travel and longer hours during certain projects, but it represented real professional growth. When I shared the news with Michael, he seemed happy for me, at least initially. Later that evening, he mentioned speaking with Patricia about it. By the following weekend, the entire conversation had changed. Patricia worried that the new position would create stress. She questioned whether additional travel would be healthy for our marriage. She suggested that family should come before career ambitions. Suddenly, the promotion was no longer being discussed as an achievement. It was being discussed as a potential mistake. What surprised me was not Patricia's opinion. Everyone is entitled to an opinion. What surprised me was how quickly Michael adopted her concerns as his own. The excitement that had been present in our original conversation disappeared. Instead, he began asking whether I truly needed the promotion at all. I remember sitting across from him at our kitchen table, feeling completely stunned. The man who should have been encouraging me was now questioning a goal I had worked years to reach. Even then, I tried to be understanding. I told myself he was simply worried. I told myself Patricia was only being protective. I accepted explanations that became increasingly difficult to believe. Similar situations continued to happen. If I wanted something, there always seemed to be another voice evaluating whether it was acceptable. If Michael wanted something, support appeared much more easily. The imbalance became impossible to ignore, yet I kept hoping circumstances would improve. Friends occasionally noticed pieces of what was happening. One afternoon, my longtime friend Sarah asked a simple question during lunch. She wanted to know why Patricia seemed involved in so many aspects of our marriage. I immediately started defending everyone. As the words left my mouth, I heard how familiar they sounded. I had spent years protecting a situation that was slowly hurting me. Sarah listened quietly before saying something I never forgot. She told me that understanding someone's behavior does not mean accepting its consequences forever. That sentence stayed with me. For days afterward, I replayed it in my mind. Deep down, I already knew she was right. The signs had been there for years. The constant compromises, the repeated disappointments, the feeling that my needs were somehow less important. Whenever Patricia's preferences entered the conversation, yet despite all of it, I remained committed to the marriage. I loved Michael. I believed the man I married still existed beneath years of habits and avoidance. What I did not realize was that every excuse I made for the situation was quietly bringing me closer to a moment when excuses would no longer be enough. The moment finally arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening. There was no dramatic argument and no life-changing event. In fact, nothing unusual happened at all. That was what made the realization so powerful. Michael and I were sitting in the living room discussing plans for the upcoming summer. We had talked for months about taking a trip together. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet week away where we could reconnect and spend time focusing on each other. For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. We discussed possible destinations, compared hotel options, and even looked at photos online. Then Michael's phone rang. Patricia. I watched his expression change the moment he answered. What started as a short conversation quickly stretched into nearly 40 minutes. When he finally ended the call, he sat back down and looked uncomfortable. Before he even spoke, I already knew what was coming. Patricia thought the trip was unnecessary. Patricia believed we should save the money. Patricia suggested that summer would be a better time to help her with projects around her house. Patricia had concerns. Patricia had opinions. Patricia had once again become part of a conversation that never belonged to her in the first place. I listened quietly as Michael repeated every concern almost word for word. The vacation disappeared before it ever existed, just like so many other plans before it. Normally, I would have argued. Normally, I would have explained why this mattered. Normally, I would have spent hours trying to make him understand what was happening. But something inside me felt different that night. Instead of anger, I felt clarity. Instead of frustration, I felt certainty. For years, I believed the problem was communication. I thought if I found the right words, Michael would finally understand. Sitting there on that couch, I realized the issue was not understanding. The issue was choice. Michael understood that I was disappointed. He understood that Patricia influenced our decisions. He understood that I felt excluded. The problem was that he continued choosing the path that required the least resistance. Challenging his mother felt uncomfortable. Disappointing me felt manageable. That realization changed everything. Later that evening, after Michael went to bed, I remained in the living room alone. The house was completely silent. As I looked around the room, I thought about all the years I had spent fighting for space within my own marriage. I thought about every compromise, every disappointment, every conversation that ended with promises but no change. For the first time, I stopped asking myself how to save the marriage. Instead, I asked a different question. What would happen if I stopped carrying the entire weight of it alone? The answer frightened me because deep down I already knew it. A marriage cannot survive when only one person is protecting it. That night, I accepted a truth I had resisted for years. I was lonely inside a relationship that was supposed to be my safest place. And even more painful than that realization was understanding that Michael seemed completely unaware of how far apart we had grown. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I felt a chapter of my life quietly closing. I still loved my husband, but for the first time, I began wondering whether love by itself was enough to overcome a problem he refused to see. The days that followed felt strangely different. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface. Michael still went to work each morning. Patricia still called regularly. Our routines remained largely the same. Yet internally, something fundamental had shifted within me. For years, I had measured the health of our marriage by how hard I was willing to work to protect it. Now I was beginning to understand that effort alone could not solve a problem that required participation from both people. The realization was painful, but it was also freeing. I stopped having the same conversations over and over again. I stopped explaining why certain situations hurt me. I stopped trying to convince Michael that boundaries mattered. Not because those things were unimportant, because I was exhausted from speaking and never feeling heard. At first, Michael barely noticed the difference. He seemed relieved that our usual disagreements had disappeared. The house felt calmer. There were fewer difficult conversations. Less tension. What he did not understand was that silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is what happens when hope begins to disappear. One Saturday morning, Michael mentioned that Patricia wanted us to spend the entire weekend helping her reorganize her garage and storage areas. In previous years, I would have immediately adjusted my plans to accommodate the request. This time, I simply told him I already had plans. He looked surprised. "What plans?" he asked. I told him I was meeting friends, visiting a bookstore, and spending the afternoon however I wanted. The answer seemed to confuse him. For so long, my schedule had revolved around everyone else's priorities. Seeing me prioritize myself felt unfamiliar. That afternoon, I drove to a nearby town and spent several hours doing things I genuinely enjoyed. I walked through small shops. I had lunch at a quiet cafe. I sat by a river and read a novel for nearly an hour. None of those activities were extraordinary, yet they reminded me of a version of myself that had slowly disappeared over the years. A woman with interests, goals, and dreams that existed independently of her role as a wife. When I returned home that evening, Michael was tired from helping Patricia all day. He talked about the projects they completed and the tasks still remaining. I listened politely. Then he asked about my day. As I described everything I had done, something unexpected happened. For the first time in months, I smiled naturally. A genuine smile. Not one created to keep peace or avoid conflict. Michael noticed it immediately. "You seem happy," he said. I thought about that for a moment. The answer was complicated. I was not happy because my marriage had improved. I was happy because I had stopped waiting for someone else to give me permission to value myself. Over the following weeks, that change became more noticeable. I invested energy into friendships. I focused on personal goals. I spent less time worrying about Patricia's influence and more time rebuilding parts of myself that I had neglected. Meanwhile, Michael began noticing the emotional distance growing between us. The irony was difficult to ignore. After years of asking him to pay attention, he finally started noticing something was wrong only after I stopped asking. And somewhere deep inside, I began accepting a truth that once terrified me. If our marriage was going to survive, Michael would have to recognize the problem on his own. Because I no longer had the strength to keep carrying both sides of the relationship by myself. The change became impossible for Michael to ignore. For months, I had been the one pointing out problems, initiating conversations, and trying to repair what was slowly breaking between us. Now that I had stopped, The silence left behind was speaking louder than any argument ever could. One evening, as we ate dinner across from each other at the kitchen table, Michael finally asked the question I had been expecting. He wanted to know why I seemed distant. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. The truth was simple. I was tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Tired of competing with another person's influence inside my own marriage. Tired of explaining the same pain over and over again. Tired of hoping that one more conversation would create a breakthrough that never came. Michael listened quietly. Then he did what he had always done. He defended the situation instead of examining it. He insisted that things were not as bad as I believed. He reminded me that Patricia loved us both. He pointed to all the years we had spent together as proof that our marriage was still strong. As he spoke, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not frustration. Just acceptance. For years, I had hoped he would finally understand. Sitting there that night, I realized I could not force that understanding to happen. It had to come from him. A few days later, Patricia invited us to another family gathering. Normally, I would have attended without hesitation. This time, I declined. Michael looked surprised. He asked whether I was feeling well. I told him I simply wanted a quiet weekend to myself. He went alone. While he spent the afternoon with his family, I stayed home. I read a book on the back porch. I took a long walk through the neighborhood. I enjoyed the peacefulness of a day that belonged entirely to me. What struck me most was how little guilt I felt. For years, I had placed everyone else's expectations above my own needs. Letting go of that habit felt unfamiliar but liberating. When Michael returned that evening, he seemed unsettled. Apparently, several relatives had asked where I was. Some had expressed concern. Others were simply surprised. For the first time, my absence had become noticeable. Yet even then, Michael seemed more confused than reflective. Over the following weeks, the emotional distance between us continued growing. We remained polite. We shared the same house. We followed the same routines. From the outside, everything probably looked normal. But inside the marriage, something essential had changed. I was no longer fighting to be seen. I was no longer asking to matter. The hardest part was realizing how long I had confused endurance with hope. Endurance keeps you surviving. Hope requires evidence that things can improve, and evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to find. One quiet evening, I sat alone on the back porch watching the sun disappear below the horizon. The air carried the first signs of autumn, and the trees were beginning to change color. As I watched the fading light, a thought settled into my mind with complete clarity. I could not spend the rest of my life waiting for someone else to choose our marriage. If Michael was ever going to recognize what was happening, he would have to do it without being pushed. And if he never did, then I would eventually have to make a decision that frightened me more than anything else. For the first time, walking away no longer felt impossible. It felt like a future I might actually have to consider. The decision came quietly. There was no argument, no dramatic scene, and no final confrontation. One morning, after another sleepless night spent thinking about the life I had been living, I woke up with a level of clarity I had never experienced before. For years, I had waited for Michael to recognize the damage that was happening. I had waited for him to establish boundaries. I had waited for him to choose our marriage without being asked. The hardest truth was realizing that waiting had become its own prison. A week later, I accepted an invitation from my sister to stay with her for a while. She lived several hours away in a small town where life moved at a slower pace. When I told Michael I needed time away to think, he stared at me as if I had spoken a language he did not understand. "What do you mean you need time away?" he asked. I explained calmly that I felt exhausted. I told him I needed space to figure out what I wanted for my future. For the first time in years, I did not soften my words to protect his feelings. I simply told the truth. Michael looked shocked. He insisted we could talk. He promised we could work through things. Yet as he spoke, I noticed something that broke my heart. Even now, he seemed focused on fixing the immediate crisis rather than understanding how we arrived there. A few days later, I packed several suitcases and left. The drive to my sister's house felt surreal. The farther I traveled from home, the lighter I felt. Not because I was happy. The situation was still painful. But for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer carrying the full weight of a marriage by myself. My sister welcomed me warmly and never pressured me to explain more than I wanted. The quietness of her home gave me room to think. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening back home. Without me there, Michael started noticing things he had overlooked for years. Meals did not magically appear. Family schedules were not automatically organized. Holidays and gatherings required effort he had rarely seen because I had always handled the details. More importantly, he began experiencing the emotional emptiness that had been growing inside our marriage for years. Several times he called me. Our conversations remained respectful, but they felt different now. For the first time, he asked questions instead of offering explanations. He wanted to know when I first started feeling alone. He wanted to know why I stopped sharing my frustrations. He wanted to know whether there was anything he had missed. The answer was painful. He had missed a great deal. One evening, during a long phone conversation, Michael admitted something he had never said before. He told me he was beginning to see how often Patricia's opinions had shaped decisions that should have belonged to the two of us. He confessed that he always believed there would be time to address the issue later. Now he was realizing that later had finally arrived. As I listened, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. For years, I had wanted him to see the truth. Now that he finally was, I could not help wondering whether he had discovered it too late. Because sometimes the greatest loss is not what disappears suddenly. Sometimes it is what slowly slips away while someone is too distracted to notice it happening. 3 months passed before Michael and I met face to face again. During that time, we spoke occasionally on the phone, but most of our conversations were focused on understanding rather than convincing. For the first time in many years, he was listening without immediately defending his mother or explaining away my feelings. The change was real. The problem was that change arrived after years of damage had already taken place. We met at a small coffee shop halfway between my sister's town and our home. When I walked through the door, I immediately noticed how different Michael looked. He seemed older somehow, not physically, but emotionally. The confidence that came from assuming everything would always remain the same had disappeared. After we sat down, he spoke honestly. He told me he had finally established boundaries with Patricia. He told me difficult conversations had taken place. He admitted that for years he confused loyalty to his mother with responsibility to his marriage. Most importantly, he accepted that nobody else had caused the distance between us. His choices had played a major role. Listening to him brought a sense of peace I had not expected. Not because it erased the past. It did not. But because the truth was finally being acknowledged. For years, I had felt invisible. Now I felt heard. We talked for hours. We discussed memories, regrets, and the life we once imagined building together. At one point, Michael looked at me and asked whether we could start over. The question hung between us for several seconds. I cared about him deeply. Part of me always would. But another part understood something equally important. Some losses cannot be repaired simply because someone finally understands them. I told him the truth. I said that forgiveness and reconciliation are not always the same thing. I forgave him. I genuinely did. Carrying bitterness no longer served any purpose. But forgiveness could not automatically restore years of trust that had slowly disappeared. Michael nodded quietly. I think he already knew that answer before asking the question. As we prepared to leave, he said something I will never forget. He told me that he spent years believing there would always be another chance to prioritize our marriage later. Another conversation. Another opportunity. Another tomorrow. By the time he realized how serious the situation had become, many of those opportunities were gone. Standing in the parking lot, I felt sadness for both of us. Not because our story lacked love. In many ways, there had been plenty of love. The tragedy was that love was never protected properly. Boundaries were ignored. Priorities became confused. Important truths were postponed until they became impossible to avoid. As I drove away, I did not feel anger. I did not feel victory. I felt closure. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. I had finally learned that a healthy marriage requires two people willing to protect it. One person cannot do the work alone forever. Michael eventually understood that lesson too. Unfortunately, understanding arrived only after he had already lost the very thing he assumed would always be waiting for him.